We have had several hours today of some exciting set of investigative sort of learning of projects around the country. We've talked about the macro dynamics that are driving social change and the increasing need for us to have some of these types of conversations. We're hopeful in this time to learn about some really terrific work that's being led by BSR, and Jennifer Stark will speak to that in just a moment. We also hope to highlight some of the infrastructure that is key to be able to scale this type of work. When you hear about this kind of work, often there's simultaneous enthusiasm and a little bit of overwhelm, like where would I get started? And so we want to try to break some of this down into what might be next steps, or maybe you're already on the journey and you're looking for not just to get started, but to accelerate your work or to add more people to the network you formed. So we'll move now to hear from Jennifer Stark. She's co-director of the Center for Business and Social Justice, and she'll give a little bit more introduction about herself, and then we'll talk about some of their work and what they're doing and what they're learning, and then we look forward to hearing questions from you in the audience.
Great. Can folks? Okay, here we go. I think I'm kind of quick to learn here on the setup. Well, thanks everyone for having me here today. Thanks Terry, thanks Alina for this wonderful invitation. It feels really refreshing and awesome to walk into a building where you see Albert Einstein quoted on the edifice. It feels really, really good. So I'm with BSR, and I got a couple slides to part of my dog and pony show to tell me to share with you all what we're about here. BSR, by way of background, Business for Social Responsibility, is a 30-plus-year-old nonprofit consulting organization that works with a network of 350 plus of the world's largest companies on a range of issues from human rights to sustainability and beyond. Thank you. Located across the world, the network is really the superpower and the value add of BSR as far as bringing companies together to conquer complex problems, as well as to work individually with companies and provide advice on some of the emerging pressing issues of our time in this decisive decade. Next slide. And then just a sampling of the breadth, both business to business, business to consumer companies. Again, the superpower of BSR really is working with the private sector across all of these issues. Next slide. I often share these types of remarks where I'm setting up some of the opportunity for systems change and infrastructure reform to remind folks, particularly in a domestic audience, the journey that the private sector's been a part of when it comes to supporting social movements and social investments across the decades. Hopefully, in revisiting some of the history, that we're collectively able to think about our place in time beyond the day-to-day news cycle, and also draw courage from the way in which the private sector has played a critical role across the decades in advancing social movements, mission, vision, and values that we all collectively support. Next slide. BSR, over the past few years, and especially over the past decade, has been called in by BSR's member companies to help tackle a range of issues, from protecting democracy, which the CEO of BSR, Aaron Kramer, himself says, if you would have told him 20 years ago that would be a pillar of the kind of work that BSR is working on, he maybe wouldn't have believed you. So from voting rights to gun violence, which I'll talk about in a bit, to the way in which environmental and climate justice has come to the fore as a material issue with very tangible scenarios that now companies at all levels are having to consider. BSR, again, over time has had to create a container to help companies address and think about these issues. And this Center for Business and Social Justice, which I'm pleased to co-lead with my colleague Jared Green, who, for those of you who were listening in or here this morning, moderated an earlier panel, is this new space, the startup within BSR, to think about how we work with companies on this more ambitious agenda. Next slide. And as mentioned, again, this center is new. It's exciting, it's a learning agenda, it's an emerging strategy, and again, the hope is that what we offer aren't necessarily new benchmarks and more white papers. There's certainly utility in those, and there's a lot of great folks working on them. But the center will be about creating spaces for companies alongside advocates, civil society partners, and NGOs behind closed doors to hash out some real challenges. What stands in the way of unlocking corporate power on so many of the issues that we care about? So the hope is that we build towards this ambitious agenda that provides an on-ramp for companies to engage more in collective action. In other words, advocacy and public policy where companies can play an outsized role. Next slide. Great. And these are some of the big questions that we're asking companies. How can they authentically engage in social justice? What would it look like to apply a social justice lens to their operations? I mean, each of these questions on its own could be a dissertation and take years of study. Unfortunately, I think back to that commercial where there was sort of that remember that was easy button, you know, and you would push it. There's no pause for that in real life. So we're doing all this work in real time while, you know, everything seems day to day on fire around us. So we're diving in. Next slide. Some of what we're learning already from the center's key stakeholders, again, BSR's members who represent leading companies in the private sector, as well as civil society partners that work across multiple issues. What we're learning is there is a real need to create this kind of space, this non-adversarial, constructive space where we can get at the heart of what business does best and what civil society organizations do best to try and identify where are those areas we can collaborate on a collective action agenda. Next slide. Great, there we go. All right, so yeah, so I'll transition there. Sorry, Terry, I thought I tucked another slide in there, but that's a bit about where I'm coming from my point of view in the role of BSR in this new center.
That's a terrific background. So you talked a little bit about how the center is organized and some of the history of shepherding change. And I'm curious, how can companies play a more significant or intentional role in achieving health equity?
In so many ways, that is just the question of our time, that health equity and economic equity are interrelated. I would say there's three critical things that the private sector can do. I have two kids, one of whom's in elementary school, so I always do things in threes with a lot of alliteration. So companies need to acknowledge their role. They need to ask, and I'll go back to this, they need to ask their workers their priorities, and they need to ask and probe with their landscape of insurers and healthcare apparatus as critical consumers, and they need to act. So acknowledge, ask, and act, and I'll unpack each of those very briefly. You know, in 2021, more than 49% of workers in America accessed health insurance through their employers. And certainly this ecosystem is, you know, very unique to infrastructure here in the US and the stakeholders involved, but employers play an outsized role in the health and well-being of workers, of families, and communities in which they live and work. Companies are also consumers of healthcare, can mind the quality of the networks in which they participate, the provision of care therein. You know, it's not hard to think back of, you know, a couple different examples of ways in which care that perhaps at one time was more niche or stigmatized or maligned has become a standard of care, in large part because employers and workers and communities have driven the market and the model. You think back just decades when HIV/AIDS prevention, testing, treatment, and linkages to care, was stigmatized. And again, now it's standard. You think of IVF and artificial reproductive technology, because again, once was very niche, and now companies are racing to the top in the provision of those benefits. So population health is essentially material to workers at all levels, to consumers, to communities. And the fact that workers often depend on the goodwill of their employers for accessible, inclusive benefits, is increasingly untenable without a level playing field. And then this gets to ACT. There are many opportunities where companies can play a role in enabling quality, inclusive public policy that will advance, again, a level playing field and directly address this interconnection between health and economic equity. Just, 2 examples I'd like to cite. Only 21% of workers in the U.S. can access paid family medical leave through their employers, right? This number is even worse when you think about part-time workers or low-wage earners. When we think about how we fix broken rungs and the role of gender and racial equity in workplaces, things like paid family medical leave and the role of many workers as caregivers throughout the course of their career is intrinsic. One other example, when it comes to things like birth equity, we think about issues like midwifery, doula care, postpartum mental health, lactation care. We're not talking about sort of sorcery here. We're talking about evidence-based interventions and things that are called out in the Black Maternal Health Momnibus Act that could certainly be advanced with additional corporate support. So I think there's a lot of opportunities for business to get on board and challenge the market and push the market and lean into the outsized role that they play when it comes to collective action and public policy.
That's really good. Thank you. I have a couple of questions then. One would be, so when businesses want to be a part of playing an authentic role in advancing social justice, how do you go about that with them, including what are the types of engagement groups that are brought together? One of our themes today is, to what extent is the board involved? To what extent do you expect other mobilizing structures to be stood up inside the company, because now sort of the change is getting hardwired, things like that, so that maybe it makes it a little more in color, what it means to engage fully in this pursuit.
I feel like there should maybe be a bingo card these days for every time we use the word engagement, and what does that mean? And perhaps even social justice, because now it has become sort of the shiny buzzword. And one thing before I go any further, I think what the world doesn't need, dare I say, is the private sector publishing reports on their social justice work. Intrinsic to social justice, I think, are 2 things, and then I'm going to circle back to your questions, Terry. Are companies acknowledging harmful systems and practices over time, whether or not that particular employer or company played a direct or indirect role. It's important to acknowledge the harm of the existing systems within which business has operated and often found opportunity. Interrelated to this is the outsized role, again, that companies can play when it comes to systems change. And that's what social justice is about, is unlocking that power. I think there's great examples, in the throes of this, very chaotic time, especially during COVID, where we did see companies in the moment, react not only with business operations in mind, but with the humanity, whether or not they were providing subsidies for childcare for frontline retail workers or other kinds of workers deemed as essential. They stood up policies and practices to help their critical workforce be where they're needed to be. And I think we also see, in the wake of passage of significant public policy like the Inflation Reduction Act, we see that included critical measures around climate and environmental justice. We see renewed efforts from the oil and gas industry to engage fence-line communities and to engage in deep dialogue about what are the things that these communities need, particularly those that, have a decimated tax base and may not have, modern infrastructure. And this forces folks in industry to show up with a different kind of toolkit than they might otherwise. So I think there's a lot of kind of points of light, if you will, in terms of companies applying a social justice lens to their work. There's not sort of some new list handed down on high of, these are social justice actions that you need to take. It's often a lot of the existing gaps or things companies haven't gotten to or felt the urgency around over the decades, I think, is the opportunity. And I think that's a really great point, Terry, talking about how organizations create the scaffolding for enduring change. I think there's a lot of different models through which the social justice mindset evolves and is ultimately applied within the private sector. Some of it's CEO-led and championed. Sometimes it's external pressure from advocate groups, from the investor class that begin to drive change and force some alignment. That's another one of those, right, bingo card words, engagement and alignment. And anytime somebody says those in the private sector, say, what do you mean? How do we do that? I should come up with that card at some point. So I think it's really, companies have a fantastic muscle memory at doing this scenario planning, at thinking cross-functionally when they're forced to do so. And this is just another opportunity to bring that skill set. Without hopefully going on too much of a tangent, one other example of where this opportunity for alignment is just so ripe. Companies, historically have had all these different functional areas that are increasingly being called in and called upon to support diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, as well as, again, increasingly government relations and the role, the outsized influence that companies have when it comes to public corporate political giving. And their work with office holders. And that is just an area ripe for leadership, for a company to align their investments with regard to the candidates that they support, their lobbying and influence expenditure, with their internal policies and practices that they're seeking to enact. So I would say there's a lot of opportunity for companies. Again, there's some low-hanging fruit here for companies to really call in this work and do it in a 21st century way.
We've almost achieved bingo. Well, now you've got me. Now you have me counting. So I one of the things we talked about earlier today was, there are polar issues that are polarizing is actually different from balancing a polarity and homeostasis. And there was some discussion in a hallway at one point, and those actually are different things. And a polarity that is extreme and unresolved can actually weaken the ability to find common ground and move forward. And so I'm curious, in your work, there are flashpoint issues that come up, and you have to decide, or the company does, or maybe or employees do. Can we find common ground, or does this become an issue? Maybe ESG. I noticed on your timeline, I think it was on slide 4, that mentioned ESG blowback, and that's starting to see what does that mean. So the question is, what are the conversations that are happening? What's the work you do around flashpoint issues and the conversations that occur on whether to how to move forward in those situations?
So here's where sometimes I say this lovingly, my advocate and civil society and NGO friends get upset with me. Dare I say, you feel like sometimes you're doing something right if everyone's a little bit unhappy with you. So you make the economic argument first. You make the business case first. You think about those concentric circles of stakeholders that businesses respond to: workers, consumers, investors, business media, and on out. And, 2 examples of how BSR has and I'll talk about ESG as well. It's just, two very key flashpoint issues that have come up over the years. BSR partnered several years back with Everytown for gun safety on the development of a toolkit, and not just sort of an on-the-shelf, 80-page piece of work, but an easily applicable tactical set of guardrails that not only make the business case for companies to mind the direct threats that gun violence has on their workplace, but to apply a framework for action internally and externally. And this also included some deep dives by industry and region. In 2022 alone, and I checked this just before coming in here today, there's been 604 what's qualified as quote unquote mass shootings in 2022 in schools and healthcare facilities and groceries and other types of settings. And obviously this is also compounded that these are often, folks that were recently, are always essential, but deemed especially essential during COVID, who face this outsized risk. And more than 70% of voters support stricter gun control. I know we're in the wake of, recently there's been some federal legislation passed that enables a bit more by way of background checks and closing some loopholes. I think there's an appetite for a lot more. I think business needs a lot more. And I think to the extent that BSR has really tried to frame this as, in working directly with members, they experience this day in and day out. They're having incidents with regard to guns in their dressing rooms. Folks, things are falling out of folks' pockets. They're worried about who might show up in their workplace. It's an ongoing issue. And again, I think when we make it about, again, going back to these concentric circles and apply this economic lens, apply a lens of risk and worker well-being, I think it starts to take some of the fear away in regard to, this is a polarizing issue and how am I stepping in? And I'd say, the same goes, in the wake, it's, we're in this hall, this, reverence to science, and evidence-based interventions here. And, we do have this slow rolling, moving, public health crisis that, affects more than half the population here in the U.S. in the wake of the fall of Roe and the Dobbs decision from the Supreme Court this summer. This is an ongoing public health emergency, and we need to think about this issue as far as workplace impact and as an economic issue, that women that don't have access to abortion are 3 times more likely to leave the workforce, 4 times more likely to live in poverty. 1 in 4 women will need access to this form of care in their lifetime. Workers 2 to 1 want to live in a state where abortion's legal and accessible. And there's been some data that shows that restrictions to abortion care amount to, and this was pre the fall of Roe, $105 billion in economic losses from existing barriers to care. And you can imagine in this new environment, the number's even greater. So again, this is another one of those issues when we start to approach it in terms of worker well-being, talent mobility, stakeholder expectations. I think we're able to unpack and put aside what might be viewed as sort of the emotional, values-laden dialogue around this and really view this as the public health issue that it is. That's the hope.
Thank you. So as we've talked today, we have talked about what I think of kind of first order work in this space where companies look first internally and they look at what are they doing, how are they providing for their own employees, what is the awareness and sensitization of their at leadership levels and with staff, and that's sort of one category. Another is when employers and businesses begin to say, hey, our actual business and our buying power and the way we interface with the world is something that we can direct in a way that improves health and health equity and economic development. The third category is saying, when we come together and we align with others, maybe in a multi-industry or a multi-sectoral way, we can do things that are substantial and hopefully sustainable. And because there is this tendency to want to succeed, I think sometimes it lowers the fear of risk, because now we realize there's others that are going to be pulling with us. And so I'd like to hear, as you are in the conversations with employers, there's some triage process that goes into, do we focus internally? Do we look externally? Do we actually go take the extra work? We heard a great case study a minute ago on what's happening in St. Louis that's multi-industry, multi-sectoral in nature, or do you advise that they would take progressive steps in those three kind of in order? How is it employers think about this so that, and when they're thinking about mobilizing the latent energy and power that they have to make a difference?
I think that is very much the constant question these days in terms of how do companies think about this, and often when I'm working with them, there is no perfect here, which is also hard for companies to hear. They want to stick the landing the first time initially and button down and get it exactly right. This is a learning process. And because it has to be done with a fair amount, again, I'm going to get out the bingo card with a lot of intentionality. That's another one I'm going to use. But truly, it has to be done in a thoughtful, methodical way. So I'd sort of put the response sort of in two buckets. One, the work needs to happen from the inside out, sort of the era, right, of sort of the performative statement, or we did something on social media about X or Y, that's having an ongoing effect on the communities in which the company lives and work. That era is behind us, and now between increased internal and external scrutiny, companies need to think about their own policies and practices and the kind of culture and environment and worker well-being that they're enabling. So first, do right within your house before you begin to think in that concentric sphere externally. At the same time, and right, life is hard and we can kind of hold two opposing things in our brains, or at least I feel like Albert Einstein did, so we can take courage from him in that. Companies are also in a tough spot. They're left to, these days, particularly at the state level, to mitigate a lot of harm of extreme policy or not quite thought through policy or existing infrastructure gaps on, childcare, education, you name it, public health. So I would also kind of offer another piece that I offer up to companies often is, first mitigate the harm on the communities in which you live and work, and that starts with your workforce, and being able to think through those things at once in a clear-eyed, pragmatic way. And the other piece I'd say is invite in, as hard as it is, the voice of dissent. You want to bring community stakeholders and advocates in to strengthen your work, to find these gaps, to give voice to communities that you may not be centering or thinking of. The closer you are to their critique, the stronger your work will be. And I do think that kind of also gets back to, I think, what was maybe the 20th century corporate mindset of, we've got it, we've thought through everything, we're aiming for perfection here, we don't need to hear from outside voices. Again, that era is behind us, and I think that's actually a real positive for all of us.
So, Bobby, there was a framework that was included in the packet that we thought we might give a little voice to, and I don't know if we can put it on the screen or if we hold it up.
Yeah, I'll say a few words about this. The last page in the handout of curated resources here is an image that it's just good to think with in some ways. I guess I'll lean into the relay metaphor, right? We're at sort of the tail end of a long day and both tired, but this is the part where we need to get into a new gear, right? If this work that we're talking about today is going to matter, it's going to have to be bigger than the individual exemplars that we've heard today. There's very little chance that no matter how great the individual stories that were spotlighted today, and dozens more that we could have if we had more time, would add up to a whole new system, a different economy, a different path for health and well-being, unless we are really thinking about the infrastructure, the environment, the ecosystem in which decisions get made. And one of the more interesting stories, for me at least, is what the group at the New Capitalism Project has done. they've done it in less visible ways. There's an article about their work in the National Civic Review a couple of years ago, handful of stories that are told in different places. But I've sort of had the privilege to watch as this evolved a little bit, secondhand, never firsthand. And I'll just say what I appreciate about this image, a little bit of the story behind what meets the eye here, at the risk of oversimplifying what is like a couple of years of really interesting, intricate work. And the first thing I like about this that you wouldn't see on the page is where it came from. It was a couple dozen deeply committed champions to a new economy. These are organizations that have been having conversations like we've had today for maybe 30 years, who've been like marquee funders and innovators in the spaces of recognizing that there are manifest inadequacies and overt harm, injustice in the way that our economy is constructed and reproduced daily. So there's no trouble with identifying the harms of the current economy. They all talk about a vision of something different, and sometimes it goes by a multiracial economy or a circular economy, a just economy, a well-being economy. They all have different sort of adjectives to characterize it. And the group that they brought together were pursuing very different theories of change, right? Some of them are really like warriors trying to force the imperative for breaking from business as usual, embrace something different. Others are really like the lovers that are trying to co-create something different. We've seen some of that dispute right here in this room today, right? The warriors and the lovers have somewhat of a different view on how to go about this work. There are also what they think of as missionaries who are sort of directing change, or entrepreneurs who are interested in the doing of it. There are a whole movement ecosystem or movement ecology of different actors. And very often people wanting a new economy end up undercutting each other because they're pursuing different theories of change, but it holds back the whole movement. And so the New Capitalism Group was very committed to bringing a bunch of those folks together to say, not to enumerate the harms of the current economy, there was no trouble doing that, but to articulate something about what they most wanted, and then to end up identifying the moves that are necessary to get there. And that's what this image ends up being. It's a number of the barriers for people who are trying to make a different economy take hold as a new norm. They were running into the bulleted barriers in each of the quadrants of this diagram. And so you could just look at these 8, right? I mean, look at in the blue box, right? There's a cult of hyper-individualism, right? There's structural racism. There's just deeply distorted ideas about what we really value, which then, sort of gets connected to other barriers about, well, if we have all this individualism and structural racism, you're going to see concentrated power and governance, and those are going to be mutually reinforcing, right? Then you're going to have inadequate, under-resourced movement power. There are lots of movements that are needed to bring this about. I loved the comments, even just in this last panel, that there is not just a single issue that's going to be the reason to make this happen. And of course, Terry started the day with the idea of multiple confronting realities, which is a lovely turn of phrase, right? If we confront the many realities which have always been there, we're going to see that we're being held back by a number of these barriers. And then, of course, in the green at the bottom, there are just the baked in ideas about what is a business model and how do we measure success and sort of what the rules of the game are. So what's interesting about the New Capitalism Group is then the idea of how do we experiment, act our way into something very different. And that's what the centerpiece of this diagram is. It's like a cheat sheet for how are we going to do as a movement, right? Are we going to be able to establish a different narrative, a unifying narrative about people's dignity, our connectedness in this work, that we have different kinds of values than we've been measuring our success on in the past? Without that narrative, we're unlikely to see success. Now, you're not just going to create the narrative and then go off and do it. It's going to have to come mutually, but it's going to end up involving what they call a multi-movement engine. We have to get prepared to be involved with more than one movement. Historically, we've been in the roundtable a little bit frustrated at the way that healthcare institutions, and I mean healthcare institutions, tend to stand up and champion the interests of healthcare, but they're often silent on the interests of education and economic development and housing. that multi-movement comfort zone is going to have to change if we're going to end up seeing sweeping patterns in all of the things that contribute to health and well-being. And it's going to have to be built for racial justice. And then you end up with this bottom tier of the time horizon that has to get involved here. We heard Greg today at the beginning talking about like a business orientation that does not look for settled science, but is willing to take risks and learn from experience. But what is that risk horizon, right? Many people dispute what that risk horizon ought to be. So this is an area of innovation and learning. We talked about fiduciary responsibility to the corporation as being only the narrowest interpretation of what our fiduciary responsibilities are. We can have nested responsibilities, not just to a company, but to its ecosystem, to its wider community, to future generations. This is an area that's contested. We see innovations all across the country and across the other countries around interpreting fiduciary responsibility differently. And then, sort of new business paradigms of how we've heard about employee ownership today. Some of the members of New Capitalism Project have been pioneers of B Corps and other forms of actually there's more than one way to run a viable company in the world. We don't just have to look to what they looked like in the 20th century or before. So I don't know. I like this image as a cheat sheet for thinking about, are we talking about not just individual innovators, but are we creating the conditions for a very different economy to emerge? And what are we willing to let go of? Are we willing to let go of the things in the barrier column in order to work towards something very, very different? So anyway, that's just a little narration of why we put this in the packet.
Terrific. Thank you, Bobby. Quick comment on your observation around healthcare. One of the things in the last few years I've noticed is there is some broadening of some of that agenda. Where many of us are aware of the Anchor Network, which is really focused on purchasing power, but I know several health systems, including the one that I'm a part of, have started doing things like being part of an equity investment group for affordable housing, for food security, and it really is multi-industry in nature. It's challenging other CEOs in the same city to come to the table and say, we have to stand up together to do things about health. And so that's very encouraging to see that more. I will also tell you in one of the communities where we were doing this that when we were, and using this as an example of where you really have to stand for what you think is right, was we were down to less than a month before we were closing on like 5 entities putting money into for equity investment in affordable housing. And one of them that was a bank, wanted to change it to debt structure, which would have altered all the dynamic. They wanted their part to be debt and everyone else to be equity. And we kind of had to stand up and say, that's not right. We've been for 6 months at the table and they're about ready to start moving dirt. And just because there's a moment to have leverage doesn't mean you should take the leverage. And so the other executives said, actually kind of returned put them on the spot and said that's just not the right thing to do. So I think there's a lot of opportunity. I'm seeing more instances of people standing up in some of these spaces that are not what we would traditionally see for business or healthcare, and of course we need more of it. But okay, do we have questions that we want to take or that are online? Okay. If you do have questions, feel free to submit them. We have some in the room here, but we're happy to take them.
This was a great panel. Thank you both for really helping wrap up the day and widening the lens a bit on it. The question I have, and the question's been asked a couple times today, and I think never quite adequately answered, and that has to do with the role of government and policy and the public sector in all of this. A boss I had for a number of years, George Halverson, wrote a book that was called Healthcare Will Not Reform Itself, or Healthcare Cannot Reform Itself. And my question is, much of the premise of the examples we've heard today has been that business can reform itself or change itself. Can we count on that? What is the role for the public sector, for government, and for policy in all of what we've been talking about today?
I'm happy to share my thoughts on that. I think that's a great question. I agree. We spend a lot of time in a lot of these spaces talking about what I'll call voluntary behavior change by companies with regard to their own internal policies and practices and the way that they show up externally. I think that has built this whole apparatus of creating these business cases, these frameworks, these multi-stakeholder endeavors, which I think are important and enduring, but only bring us to a certain point. I think there is a unique power to regulate, mandate, and require. Again, I realize for private sector folks, it's be still their hearts. I know those are tough words to hear, but there's also a lot of opportunity in that to level the playing field that then doesn't require a company or an industry to be a first mover in these spaces. So I think there's often a lot of power left on the table with regard to regulation, reform, and I think that's a really great point.
May I add to that? I think a way of looking at public policy, governmental policy, is that it is the absolute floor. We should hope that business and other sectors of our society can reform themselves, because the limit of government policy making cannot account for all of the things that many of us would like to see our nation, if not our world, become. So think of it as the floor, not the ceiling, and let's hope we can reform ourselves, because government policy cannot cover all of these considerations.
The one thing I'll add is that we spoke at the early part of the day of how the current generation is really expecting a deeper sort of set of actions by the places they work and where they sow their lives into. It may not even be driven by the pandemic. It may be it's actually been in place for the last 5 or 10 years and is growing. And to the extent that workers actually become more mobile, which is the case, lots of virtual work these days that keep people from not actually having to uproot. I wonder if that, in fact, I know that is starting to change the conversations with businesses to realize there is actually an accountability in how the business runs on the day-to-day basis because of what the workforce is expecting. That makes me, at least, I know it's not a panacea, but a little more encouraged that we'll see more. And then one of the other small examples that's hugely important that fits in this. So for 15 years, I've watched I work with a lot of employers around the country, and I've watched fairly systematically mental health benefits get chipped away. That was just a place they could, and they did. It has dramatically changed in the last 18 months across many employers that they are adding, they're going beyond the minimal. They don't want a diagnosis even. They're willing to just pay for access. They, doing all the steps to destigmatize. That's very encouraging to see something like that that's really been going in the wrong way for so long. So it gives me a little hope that could give some other examples, but I think we've got another question from Bob.
Yeah, so I just want to expand this conversation a little bit about the notion of work. So I think it's important for us to recognize that the universe of workers is not the same as the universe of employees. And that last time I looked at BLS statistics, about 1/3 of workers are not employees. And as we move toward the future of work, it seems as though we're kind of moving further in that direction. Even if you just think about this kind of halfway house of a lot of the population working from home, and even very not in the same community as wherever the headquarters is. And so that gets to really this concept of the first relay, which we've said, well, this is where businesses start. They start by looking at their own workers. What if if workers are not actually in a business in the conventional sense of the word? What does that mean in terms of, I'm curious if BSR has been thinking about this in terms of the kind of owner-operator of their own business, if you will. What does that mean in terms of the social responsibility of that? Now it's an individual business. How do those individual businesses, those individual workers now interact in these collective actions that are necessary to improve the health of themselves and of the community, et cetera? And this notion that community has a very different meaning today than before the internet. The neighborhoods are now potentially global. So my employees are even in other nations and not at a facility, but at the end of a terminal.
There we go. So a couple thoughts come to mind, and BSR works predominantly, right, with large companies with diverse workforces. I intentionally use the term workers as opposed to employees to be as inclusive as possible as far as the different forms of work, to also include contractors, part-time workers, and other kinds of workers, whereas I think employee typically implies full-time benefits eligible. I think it's important. I want to reinforce the point that millennials and Gen Z have a different set of expectations for the institutions that they work for, and those worker-employer kind of quote-unquote contracts look different. BSR has done and is doing a fair amount of work on the future of work as far as portable benefits, as well as mental health and other emerging issues that large employers in particular are facing. Something that in the question that you said made me think of this book, and I apologize, I can't remember the name of the author, but the title was so striking. It was called CEO as Urban Statesman, and how companies now sort of are functioning as these sort of quasi, dare I say, democratic entities where the C-suite has to kind of politic and sort of understand where their different stakeholders are and where their workers are. And I think, again, that era of sort of the faraway C-suite that is removed from the communities in which workers are is behind us. And I think that also affects the extent, in the question that was raised in terms of the way in which these workers are organizing and demanding a different set of benefits and expectations, and also requiring a long game approach that sort of is at war with sometimes the quarterly earnings cycles and other kinds of more short-term goalposts that companies consider. So, and I would just say, one other point that I think is important to make, these companies, there isn't, these are hard playbooks that companies are having to cobble together in real time, right? Because you've got these flashpoints, you've got new worker expectations, you've got a distributed workforce, particularly among the knowledge worker kind of top talent class. You've got different state climates and environments. It's a real tempest in a teapot times 50 that particularly, national or global companies are having to adapt to. And I think we're all, to the extent, figuring it out in real time, I think is both the opportunity and the challenge.
So there are 3 good questions from the web. I don't know if you want me to ask all of them, but I can certainly start with this one. Carla Shepard Rubinger is saying, isn't the good news that we've heard today only that above water tip of the iceberg? Aren't most businesses the big chunk below the water that we don't see?
So I assume what's meant by that is the above the water enlightened actions has been the discussion, and there's a lot of work that is not leaning in that way, and that could be true, probably is, but I think one of our points today is there's more parts of society looking at confronting reality that are even in unrelated but overlapping reasons that would give us optimism that that tip of the iceberg can begin to grow and grow at a much faster rate than it has in the past. So even though I choose to look at it as a half full situation and there's urgency, and the other dynamic we talked about today is sometimes good actions and people moving beyond the status quo is about perceiving that other people are doing the right thing. There is some right, not just being the only, even though we want companies to stand alone, sometimes they're going to stand better when they're locking arms with other employers, and we're starting to see that. We had some case studies on that today, so I don't know anything else you want to add on that.
I mean, I think back in part to the comment from the audience earlier, I think there is a lot of opportunity for, I think there's increased scrutiny. There's more out there. Companies aren't the black box, dare I say, that they used to be, for better and for worse. Again, going back, in part, the example around corporate political giving and influence has become kind of its own cottage industry, in that folks are talking about, which companies are supporting, which office holders and what's the impact of that outsized influence. Case in point, in terms of voluntary behavior change versus, what's the ceiling and what's the floor, we're coming up on the 30th anniversary of the Family Medical Leave Act. That was meant to be the floor, not the ceiling. And here we are in the wake of the pandemic, still begging for national paid family leave policy, which makes America an outlier and not in a positive way, that we still don't have that at a national level. So I think there is a lot below the iceberg, but I think things are melting in a positive way. But yet to be seen how it ends.
And maybe this is the last question, since we're going to be wrapping up, for the closing remarks from Anna. Matt Cross-Guillen said, in order for many businesses to change themselves, the pressure, i.e. legal responsibility for quarterly growth, has to change. How can we make that happen?
There's a lot to unpack there in 3 minutes time. What I'd say is, we do see through regulatory reform via the SEC increased scrutiny on many measures related to diversity, related to climate, related to transparency, and other regulatory bodies in regard to human rights and other metrics that we haven't in the past. So I hope that those kinds of benchmarks continue to drive real corporate reform. And again, I think, as the point was raised, using the power of regulation, reform, and legislation to enact some of those pieces. I don't know, Terry, if you have any thoughts.
I think it's also about redefining a little bit about what it means to have kind of quarterly performance. And it's been sort of single-threaded, and we're seeing that happen more. Of course, there's a lot of heat being generated by that, by various groups, often pulling in different directions. I think, as we're down to the last minute here, one of the things that we didn't say a lot today that maybe in other settings we would, so I got to fill up that side of my bingo card for a second, and that is we didn't talk a lot about trust today. And yet I think we all know, we got at it a little bit, but that trust is so foundational to building change. And one of the real point I wanted to make, though, is that vulnerability, which you heard in the case study in St. Louis when, there was a acknowledgement that, hey, this is a space that we're not prepared. That statement would build trust in that group for others to be vulnerable. And I'll give one other example. Many of the actions that corporations could take today, most, will cause them to actually reverse what they've been doing for the last 10 or 20 years. And if they're willing to state it, think about how culturally powerful it is. So I'll give you an example. So when our large organization declared a couple of years ago that we were going to have both in supply chain, which typically for years you aggregate your supply chain, go to bigger and bigger suppliers that can give you a lower per unit cost. That's kind of what's happened. But we said, no, we're going to have a certain percentage of from small companies and minority owned, and it's going to get bigger and bigger and bigger year over year. That literally was reverse instructions to all the supply chain people. Further, it was reinforced by every one of their annual performance goals had that hardwired into their performance. So it wasn't just an aspiration at the top that could sort of fall off people's plate. And the amount of awareness that was generated, and that meant now, instead of buying from a big supplier that might be from someplace, that we were buying locally, and so I think there are actions that could be taken, even if it's not yet a fully robust set of a plan, which is what you would want to create, that can be very productive and very powerful in the cultural transformation and building the trust, so you can start building that wall. So I think that's within the grasp of every business to do that, even if they don't feel like they're yet ready for the full conversation. Any other comments or questions? I know we're running out of time, but there's... Okay.